Large protests against new restrictions on abortion in Texas. Has the Republican-controlled state house gone too far? Plus, the rising cost of U.S. higher education. As tuition costs rise and loan rates double, we ask, is a college degree worth it? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. Thousands of protesters gathered outside the Texas State House on Monday to try and stop a sweeping bill from becoming law. The proposal would ban abortions after 20 weeks and impose strict regulations that would shut down all but a handful of abortion clinics across the vast state. Last week, Democratic Senator Wendy Davis delivered a marathon 11-hour speech inside the legislature that helped prevent the bill from passing.
The alleged reason for the bill is to enhance patient safety, but what they really do is create provisions that treat women as though they are not capable of making their own medical decisions.
But now, Texas Governor Rick Perry has convened a special session aimed almost exclusively at passing this legislation. The proposal is the latest in a series of attempts by Republican-controlled state houses across the country to pass similar measures restricting reproductive rights. But Texas is the first to see large protests in opposition, raising the question, has the Republican Party in Texas overreached? We're joined by Jim Hightower. He's a progressive political activist and a Texas-based national syndicated radio show columnist. And Andrea Grimes is a journalist and reproductive rights activist. They both join us from Austin, Texas. Andrea, first of all then, this time we do expect the law to pass. We're not expecting another filibuster then.
That's correct. The Republicans really have it together here for this second special session, and certainly they have the majority that they need both in the House and the Senate to pass this legislation. And obviously Governor Rick Perry is more than on board. So Democrats and progressives are really facing an uphill battle. Of course, it's Texas, you know, anything could happen, but our outlook is not positive at this point to quash this legislation.
Let's just very quickly run through some of the details of SB 5, Senate Bill 5. The portion of the bill that has made the headlines is the provision banning abortion after 20 weeks of pregnancy unless the mother's life is in immediate danger. But there are other provisions that place significant restrictions on when and where a woman can have an abortion. All doctors who perform abortions must have admitting privileges at a hospital within 30 miles of their clinic. Most do not in Texas. The bill also requires women taking pills that induce abortions to do so in the presence of a doctor in a certified abortion clinic. Currently, the initial dose can be given to women by nurse practitioners in clinics, and the second dose can be taken days later at home. And finally, abortions can only be performed in what are known as ambulatory surgical centers. And of the 42 abortion clinics in Texas, only 5 currently qualify as surgery centers. Andrea, give us a sense of what effect these provisions will have on women's health.
When we talk about these provisions and their negative effect, really what we're looking at is a lack of access, and for many women, a complete loss of access to safe, legal abortion care. The 5 abortion clinics that will remain open in Texas are in Houston, Austin, San Antonio, and Dallas, which basically means that everything west of I-35, which is the big interstate highway that kind of cuts Texas in half, women and other pregnant Texans that live west of 35 will have no access to any safe, legal abortion care. So we're looking at them perhaps crossing the border into Mexico to try and obtain abortions there, or perhaps trying to, use what's been called Dr. Google and try to conduct abortions themselves at home because they cannot make it, 600 or 800 miles to an abortion care provider who can do a safe and legal abortion.
Jim Hightower, one of the many perplexing parts of this issue, this story in Texas, there is that there is no public demand for these provisions, according to the polls. In fact, the recent poll shows 63% of those polled last week said the state had enough restrictions on abortion already. 19% surveyed believe the government has a right and obligation to pass more restrictions on abortion, just 19%. Nearly 3/4 of voters say that the decision about whether to have an abortion is a personal, private one and should be made between a woman, her doctor, and her family. 71% did not want lawmakers to spend more time passing abortion laws. And 8 in 10 voters said they would rather have the governor and legislature use a special legislative session to focus on education, jobs, and the economy. Jim Hightower, then what was behind this?
Well, you don't have to know who's who to know what's what, and what's what here is that this is a policy driven by ignorance and arrogance, by theocracy and autocracy, along with a giant dollop of raw political ambition on the part of David Dewhurst, the lieutenant governor, and Rick Oops Perry, our governor here, who wants to run for president again. So they're appealing to the most extreme of the extremist right wing of the Republican Party here. With a piece of legislation that, by the way, those numbers were great, but I would just point out that the number of people who don't want the government intruding into the decision by women and their doctors includes 61% of Republicans there. So this is really a bipartisan outrage, and that's why so many people responded to State Senator Wendy Davis's stand in the Senate to filibuster against this atrocity.
So this is purely then, Jim Hightower, then a matter of local Republican primary politics there. It's just a fear of a very narrow-based fear. But what about then the wider implications, even if they do retain some, their political position or move on up, continue moving on up through the Republican Party?
Well, it's like they keep trying to find yet another segment of the American population that they can offend and get to vote against them. They've certainly done that with immigrants and their voter ID legislation. They've done it before with women because Perry vetoed an equal pay provision for women in our state and has been against a number of reforms for women. And now this intrusion literally into a woman's most personal decision. There was a school superintendent in a state survey in 2007 said that his school district didn't need any sex education because many of the kids there live on farms and they get a pretty good sex education from their animals. Now, it's that animalistic outlook that has now risen all the way to high places in our state government, including the governorship, the lieutenant governorship, and the state senate.
But is this purely then a fundamentalist Christian section of the Republican Party? Because clearly the Tea Party, main tenet of it is to keep big government away. So, and of course, this is about, bringing big government into the most intimate areas of women's reproductive health. I mean, how does all this work?
I don't think it's Christian at all. There are plenty of Christians who were in the galleries protesting this action last week. This is an unchristian act against women. And this is more of a theocratic wing of the Republican Party, absolutist wing, who want to impose their ideology over the vast majority of people who oppose what they're trying to do.
Andrea, though, it's not just in Texas, though, that we're seeing legislation like this. How does this sort of legislation connect to the other states where we've seen similar bills put through?
I think what we're really seeing is Texas as a test case for this kind of, anti-woman, misogynist legislation. We've seen this kind of thing in Virginia. We've seen it in Wisconsin. We've seen it in Arkansas. We've seen it in Arizona. We've seen it in Mississippi. And really, it is, a small group of political players who are very right-wing, who are very ideological, who are very anti-science, anti-medicine, anti-women, anti-minority, who just want to see how far they can push this legislation and oppress as many people as possible in order to maintain the status quo that keeps the people they like in power. And really, a lot of this legislation is aimed at going all the way up to the Supreme Court to overturn Roe versus Wade. And that's really what's so scary about so much of this, is that, it doesn't stop at a 20-week abortion ban, and it doesn't stop at ambulatory surgical centers, and it doesn't stop at hospital admitting privileges. We're talking about a long path that ultimately is meant to end with making abortion, on the whole, illegal in the United States.
Andrea, though, I know you recently went to a National Right to Life conference and you met people there. I mean, what did they say when you said, look, this is the sort of policy that has been proven to jeopardize women's health, to increase teen pregnancies, perhaps, and so forth?
You know, it's really hard to reason with people who have some really significant blinders on in terms of who they go to for their facts. And, you know, we're talking about people who really consider the Pope to be the head authority on all issues. You know, we're talking about people who don't believe that the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists is a reasonable group of medical experts. They don't trust the Texas Medical Association. They believe that there is a large nationwide, if not worldwide, conspiracy to bolster up a billion-dollar abortion industry that they believe exists. I mean, there's really such a disconnect between what reasonable people believe, and I mean moderate Republicans and kind of your average mainstream conservatives, and what the people at the National Right to Life Convention believe, which is kind of this intricate web of conspiracies and you know, subterfuge.
And it was quite an amazing coalition, though, that we saw expressing their outrage at the State House last Tuesday on June 25th. In fact, I think we have some pictures of it. You know, Wendy Davis was giving this 13-hour speech to prevent the legislative body from voting. She wasn't allowed to eat, drink, or even use the toilet. She couldn't lean on anything. And when she reached that 11th hour of her speech, she was ruled to have gone off topic. But by then, so many supporters had gathered, partly through hearing about this on social media, that they began chanting and they prevented the state senate from carrying out the vote. Jim Hightower, as you were suggesting, though, this wasn't just a bunch of, you know, lefties perhaps in the gallery there. This was quite a wide coalition. What now then for this coalition of people then who appears to have appeared now in Texan politics of all politics? Where do you think that's going to head?
Well, it's a tremendous victory for the choice forces, tremendous victory for common sense, tremendous victory for progressivism in our state. As Wendy Davis herself said, while she was the person standing on the floor for those 11 hours plus, this was a people's filibuster. And it was the people themselves in the gallery who brought the Senate to a standstill. The rulers found that their subjects suddenly had taken charge, and now they're outraged. It's just a hoot to watch them scamper down the road saying, "Oh my God, it's an unruly mob." Well, have you ever seen a ruly mob? That's a strange concept to start with, and to see Rick Perry, Mr. Mucho Macho, be scared of a room full of women is hilarious to watch. So right, I think these leaders are going to be laughed out of the state.
But not scared enough, though, to prevent this special session from convening and from pushing this through, though. So you wouldn't.
No. Oh, no. But they re-rigged the rules already. Yesterday, they passed a thing saying instead of the two-thirds majority needed to bring up a piece of legislation, a majority can bring it up. So they're just rigging the rules for themselves, but they're also digging themselves a political hole as they do that. Do they think that people don't see this?
We'll be watching closely. Jim Hightower, thank you very much. Andrea Grimes, thank you very much as well. This week, college students in the US taking out federally subsidized student loans will find themselves paying higher interest rates than even those offered by private lenders. The US Congress determines the interest rate for federal loans, and when efforts to keep the rate at 3.4% fell apart last week, it doubled to 6.8%. Members of both parties have vowed to bring that rate back down before the fall semester begins in August. But the rate increase, even if temporary, has brought attention back to the rising cost of a college education and to the increase in student loan debt, which now stands at $1 trillion in the US. With increasing costs, is it still worth it for students to get a higher education in the US? Al Jazeera's Tom Ackerman has more.
Love you, Mom and Dad.
Graduation day, always an occasion for celebration and high hopes for the future. But it's also when university graduates have to start paying back the loans that allowed them to get this far. College sophomore Tahira Thompson won't be facing that day for a couple more years, but she's already calculating how long it will take her to pay off her debt.
It'll probably take me at least like 10 to 20 years, probably more. That's not even including if I want to go and, go to school after that, if I want to go to grad school. I can't see myself being finished paying off my loans.
Over the past 30 years, tuitions have increased each year by an average of more than 7%, far outstripping family income growth and inflation. Meanwhile, 70% of graduates this year reported their debt averaged more than $35,000. According to the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank, the mounting student debt has a far-reaching effect on the overall economy. It delays home buying and even marriages, as loan repayments make it harder to save. Some critics say it's time to reassess the entire system of financing tuition for higher education, and they want universities to rein in their costs on things beyond their core mission of teaching.
The amount that they're spending on new dorms or sports facilities or things like that, that money that actually isn't going to educating students directly. We also see the number of tenured professors going down.
Tahira says she may be poor for a long while, but her education is ultimately a good investment.
Whereas if I didn't go, I would just be stuck probably, and there would be, I wouldn't have any hope of going anywhere. At least now, there's at least some glimmer of hope at the end of the tunnel.
Yet for many others, there may be less hope, because after going into debt, more than 40% of full-time university students fail to graduate within 6 years. Tom Ackerman, Al Jazeera, Washington.
And joining us now from Las Vegas, Nevada, is Tim Donovan. He's a blogger who focuses on millennial political and economic issues. Here in the studio, we're joined by Brett Williams. She's professor of anthropology at American University and author of the book Debt for Sale, A Social History of the Credit Trap. Actually, Professor Williams, that's not a bad place to start. There are a lot of people making a lot of money out of these loans, both the government and financial institutions.
Yes, and I think that's one of the things that people don't know about student loans is how profitable they are for people who make the loans, and also for all the collection agencies when people go into default. So they're very profitable, and they're profitable to Wall Street as well, because they're securitized and traded. And
sliced and diced.
Exactly.
Right. Well, let's just run through, first of all, some background as to why so many need loans in the first place. The cost of attending both private and public universities in the U.S. has been steadily rising. The average cost of a 4-year college degree has risen by more than $12,000 a year over the past 2 decades. So in 1980, students and their parents paid an average of $35,000 for their 4-year degree. But by 2010, that cost was nearly $90,000. And college costs have risen more sharply than the overall price of consumer goods. Those rising costs have contributed to the quadrupling of student debt over the past 10 years. It's now almost $1 trillion. Tim Donovan, what's the reason for this huge increase in the cost? I wonder whether the huge market for student loans has some impact as well as just the austerity measures that we might assume.
Well, it's an interesting problem because it's largely caused by the things that we want. As costs go up, we're very comfortable. Students demand more services. It's understandable if you're paying $30,000 a year to want a dorm room that's not flea-ridden. And these are these desires really cause an issue, because these desires only encourage the schools to increase costs and just move the entire system on forward. I think it's really interesting that when we talk about bankruptcy law, as I mentioned in my article, we mentioned that it's a moral hazard to allow students to declare bankruptcy. Yes. It's much larger a moral hazard to let creditors know that students will never be able to declare bankruptcy and that these are the safest loans you can offer. And I don't think that gets discussed nearly enough in mainstream discourse.
Let's underline that point, Professor Williams, then. They're called loans, but yet they can never be discharged through bankruptcy proceedings.
Right. They can garnish your wages, garnish your will, garnish your taxes, your tax refunds. You can never get out of student debt.
And your grandparents who may have co-signed, actually, I suppose.
But Tim, don't you think
college... And a lot of parents co-sign.
Yeah.
Yes.
Professor Williams.
Don't you think college should be free like it is in most countries in the world?
Absolutely. I think that the biggest mistake we make, and the thing I always want to focus on, is college is not a bad thing.
Right.
We should be extraordinarily happy that right now more 18 to 24-year-olds are enrolled in a degree-granting institution than any other time in history.
Right, but
it shouldn't be a problem. It shouldn't be a disaster.
The reason people are enrolling in these college courses and taking on these huge loans, as we heard from Tahira Thompson in the report we just saw there, is it's worth it in the long run. And there have been a variety of studies that claiming college graduates earn significantly more over their lifetimes than non-graduates. A study by the Brookings Institution shows college graduates earning on average $500,000 more than non-graduates. A study by Georgetown University puts that number even higher, at $2.7 million over the lifetime. But research by the Heritage Foundation, which took into account tuition payments, student debt loads, and actual salary data, showed much less of an advantage for college graduates, $279,893 over one's lifetime. Tim Donovan, you helped us see that there were real problems in the methodology then of some of these studies that had been carried out in the past and had been taken pretty much as common sense, really, that you have a college degree, you will do better over your life. These studies hadn't even taken into account the student debt load, which is quite flabbergasting.
It's really incredible, and it's a major problem because these have been accepted for an extremely long period of time, and the methodology, it's embarrassing. The notion that a 65-year-old journalist that's about to retire is making the kind of money that a person my age is going to make at that point is absurd. The fact that you can work from your 20s into your late 60s full-time as a journalist is something that people my generation can't really rely on. And that really evinces the problems with these studies.
So these studies didn't take into account the changing pattern of labor in the United States then, that we don't simply have these jobs for life anymore?
It's just shoddy methodology, first and foremost. It really speaks to just you're looking for certain numbers to promote your narrative, and I really think that more than anything else probably explains where these numbers came from. And that's why the numbers are so wide, why you can get a number like 260 or 700,000 or 2.7 million.
But does that then lead to the conclusion, though, that it's simply not worth getting a higher education degree, in your opinion? Though?
But it's worth going to college.
It leads to the conclusion that...
Well, Tim, very quickly, and then Professor Williams.
All right, the only thing that I would say about that is that I am a great example of why you need to go to college. I have a degree, and I don't work in a field that requires one. And as a consequence, there are people who don't have a degree that can't get the real, service industry work, menial work, because they're competing with college-educated, people that can't get work in their own relevant fields. I mean, this affects all Americans, and that's why it's a problem that we need to fix so desperately. So
the reason to get a degree in that argument there is simply so that you can get the part-time menial job that is more often on offer then? I mean, and meanwhile those with no skills are getting completely pushed out of the market.
Well, I think what that tells you is really this is a jobs issue more than it is a debt or education issue. And then these are two separate issues that we both need to confront. The fact that there aren't enough jobs, that new firms, Google, Facebook, Apple, simply don't need to employ nearly as many people as the Kodaks, the GEs, the GMs of the past, is an existential threat to American success.
Professor Williams, I mean, so many issues then sort of bound up in all of this. But what do you make of the argument then that the argument for getting a degree, that in the long run it is going to pay off? I mean, it doesn't...
Well, the problem is having an economy based on selling debt to people instead of doing useful things. But I still think that a college degree is worth it because you learn... People are transformed by college lots of times. They learn to think critically. They learn to demand justice.
Right, but perhaps increasingly those sorts of skills aren't needed by employers, according to Tim.
Right, they want us to go to for-profit schools,
right,
to get loans and go to these for-profit schools and not learn to think critically and not learn to demand justice. But I still think it's worth it to go to college, not for financial reasons. I completely agree with Tim about that.
Tim, what's the way out of all this then, do you think? I mean, you talked about free higher education for all, but that seems very unlikely in the US, partly because so many people are making so much money out of the system as it is.
Well, the question is, are we talking about society or are we talking about individuals? Because for individuals, I think there is a way out. And I think you just have to find a way to get through college taking on as little debt as you possibly can. You need to be afraid of the law school, MBAs that are extraordinarily expensive programs with really questionable job prospects going forward. But that's what we can individually do. As a society, I really agree with Professor. I think we really do need to find a way to make school free in certain instances. I agree that there is an intrinsic value, but the problem is that that intrinsic value does not equate to $40,000 in student lones per year.
Right.
And that's absurd.
You'd agree with that?
Yes, I completely agree with that.
All right, well, we'll have to leave it there, but we'll definitely return to this topic at a future date. Professor Brett Williams, thank you very much. Tim Donovan, thank you as well.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Share ideas with us on Twitter. Our handle is AJ Inside Story AM.